Dr. Douglas Lewis, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
What is jail-based competency restorative service?
So, jail-based competency restoration services, it's a mix of not only psychiatric treatment, but also legal education, where individuals who have been opined incompetent to stand trial undergo or participate in order to become competent to stand trial. And so essentially what the individual who participates in such services will be linked with a psychiatrist who determines a medication regimen for that individual. And then also they participate in classes that focus on courtroom personnel, weighing the evidence in terms of plea bargaining, basically anything related to the judicial system. And they undergo even participation in mock trials as they continue to become better through medication, psychotropic medication. And then eventually, once they finish those services, they'll be ready for court.
Why is this such a big issue?
It has become quite a colossal issue in that so many states are experiencing what we're calling a competency crisis, which means that there are not enough forensic beds in order for individuals to undergo such treatment in the hospital setting, which while ideal, has presented a lot of challenges. There's an increased amount of time for individuals to actually get evaluated, determine their competency. But even once they become evaluated, there's even more of a lag in them actually receiving services. So we have a lot of individuals who end up in the jails for a greater amount of time than they should on the front end. And they are what is called, they're in a status called pretrial defendants, rather than necessarily detainees or facing some type of consequence. They're on the very front end of the adjudicative process. And it becomes concerning because, ideally these people would be moved through the system as quickly as possible. But there are individuals who are sometimes waiting years before they even face, trial.
What type of issues or mental health issues are common in these types of people? And how does the latency period, like you explained, affect their mental health and their process of recovering from mental health issues?
Those are awesome questions. So essentially, those who are found not competent to stand trial tend to fit into one of three different groups. Either they have active symptoms of psychosis, they're intellectually disabled, or they have some type of cognitive problems, or a combination of both. And so what is needed is that, particularly if they have psychotic symptoms, is that they need to be placed on a medication regimen, particularly psychotropic medications or antipsychotic medications, in order to treat the symptomatology or the symptoms that we're observing or that are impeding their competency to stand trial. Unfortunately, if they have not been evaluated, and if they are not receiving any restoration services, there's a strong likelihood that they're remaining in jail without any medication, because most jails in the state of Georgia in particular cannot issue or levy forced medications. And so often they're just sitting in the cell. Some of them are so behaviorally dysregulated because of their psychosis that they literally don't leave the cell. So they're not showering a lot of times. The jail staff work hard to try to make sure that they're feeding themselves and eating. However, when someone is that, altered in their mental status, sometimes we have individuals who believe that people are poisoning their food so they won't eat. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of challenges that the jails are facing when there's this lag between evaluation and treatment. I will say that usually at the outset, if they're not competent to stand trial, the heaviness or the emotional burden that may come from being or having charges, they typically aren't that impacted because a lot of them, their mental status is so altered that they really don't understand the gravity or the seriousness of, why they're in jail. Um, because they are so psychotic, or they have so many cognitive problems. It takes
Mhm.
treatment in order for that burden to come. So for example, I've worked with quite a few individuals who were not competent to stand trial, and their charges were sex crimes, or such as child molestation, or sexual exploitation of a minor. Now, these individuals at the outset of treatment were so psychotic that they were saying things that didn't make sense or that were incoherent. They were reporting that they were hearing things. So those were the foremost issues that they were facing. Now, once they received psychiatric treatment and started learning about the criminal justice system, that is when the emotional heaviness or the burden set in. And often, you could see them become more depressed or saddened. You could see them become more anxious. That's when it was very clear that they actually, were moving towards being competent to stand trial, because you understand the consequences of your actions or of your charges should you be convicted. So that type of emotional heaviness usually doesn't come until a little bit, a few weeks or months after they've received treatment consistently.
So when someone commits a sex crime, like you said, who a person who has psychosis, um, how would you say, like, a person who has psychosis, like, when we look at their social history, like
Mhm.
why does people with psychosis why do they commit sex crimes? Like, do you have, like, is there any data around it in their, like, social history as well, that kind of like, we can tell, okay, this person is predictive of committing sex crimes?
Not because of their diagnosis with a mental illness, no.
Hmm.
So I want to make sure it's quite clear that when individuals who have a severe and persistent mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, all of these different types of severe and persistent mental illnesses that may emerge, um, there's really no connection between an individual having a mental illness and them committing a crime. That's those are two very much mutually exclusive things. Now, granted, there are certain personality disorders that may connect with the committing of crimes. For example, an antisocial personality disorder. Someone who has that may commit crimes, or may have a propensity or proclivity of committing crimes or breaking the laws, or violating boundaries or rules. However, individuals who have traditional or severe and persistent mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, etc., those individuals there's no particular crime or pattern of crime connected. Those individuals are more likely actually to be harmed than to actually be someone who commits crimes. Now, in these particular instances or examples that I provided with individuals who were not competent to stand trial due to psychosis, but had committed sex crimes. So we have to keep in mind that psychosis, when you are being consistently treated, those symptoms are not such that you're completely out of your mind or you have an altered status. So you can have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and function almost just as well as those who don't have the diagnosis, if you're being properly treated and you're following your medication regimen as prescribed by the psychiatrist. The problem happens is that often people who don't have the proper social resources or safety nets, they often go off of their medication. And then once you're off of your medication, that's when those symptoms emerge and they become more and more severe. Now, in these instances, um, at the time that they were alleged to have committed these offenses, these individuals were not in a psychotic state. They were functioning just fine. These were decisions that they made, allegedly of sound mind. Um, and we have to remember that psychosis, in terms of symptoms and severity, can be intermittent. Um, in that if someone's getting their medication and they're taking it like they're supposed to, then they're fine. But the moment or that they stop taking and weeks and months go by without taking it, that's when they can start to decompensate. So even after we're able to restore someone to competency, if they don't go to court, soon thereafter, and they're no longer getting that type of making sure that we're staying on top of them, that they're getting treated, etc., they can actually decompensate after being restored to competency. So I just want to make sure that we divorce our thoughts from that there's a connection between a severe persistent mental illness and a pattern of crime, because typically that's just not the case. Often these individuals, we start seeing their symptoms again when they stop taking their medication. So,
Hmm. Okay. Uh, can you briefly describe the mind of a person who has psychosis? Because I think I need to brush up on it, and I feel like obviously people who are listening, watching may need a little bit a review of that, if you
okay.
can.
So psychosis traditionally can come in one, two, or a combination of the two ways that I'm about to describe. So essentially, it can be characterized by hallucinations, whether auditory, visual, which those two are the most common, olfactory, meaning scent or smells, tactile, meaning touch. So basically, any of the senses, one can experience hallucinations. But then also, someone can be considered psychotic who experiences delusions. And there are different types of delusions, but I will briefly state that some of the most common ones are paranoia, thinking people are out to get you or people are trying to poison you, or persecutory, meaning that people are kind of coming after you, they're punishing you for no reason, delusions. And then they're grandiose delusions, where you think, you may think you're the king of the world, or you may think you're the second coming of Jesus, and truly believe that. And so hallucinations and delusions are the hallmarks of psychosis. Now, someone may also observe psychosis in how people communicate with them. If there's some disorganization of thought, for example, you're talking to someone about the price of tea, and all of a sudden they respond to you talking about how they had to walk their dog down the road and et cetera, et cetera. So they start to basically answer or respond to you in things that are nonsensical or incoherent. So you can't follow them or their pattern of thought. Now, sometimes you may find that people totally veer off and are off topic to the point where they don't come back. They just keep going. It's complete what we call word salad. So they're just spitting out stuff. Or they have loose associations where, you may talk about a ball, and then the next thing you know, they're talking about, how they were playing football when they were 11 years old. And you're like, where did this come from? And so disorganization, hallucinations, and delusions are the three kind of anchors to how we know that someone may be experiencing some psychotic symptoms or psychosis.
And when we look at the neuroscience of this, if you may, how we just learned about this. There is a, obviously you might know this, brain region called Wernicke's area, the
Mhm.
parietal temporal area, and that is responsible for production of speech, I believe. Actually, no, comprehension
Mhm.
of speech. But if someone has a damage in that area, um, that person could exhibit word salad. Is that right? Or how's that connected to the
Yes.
psychosis?
So when we learn, we usually talk about Wernicke's and Broca's areas or regions. And
Hmm.
so what you're talking about, yes. So if someone experiences like aphasia or some type of, you're talking about some kind of organic type damage to areas of the brain that either
Hmm.
produce that are either responsible for comprehension or responsible for your ability, your expressive. You're talking about kind of like receptive, which is kind of comprehension and your ability to understand, as well as expressive skills, language skills, which expressive is your ability to communicate or convey some type of thought or idea.
Hmm.
Those areas, when they're damaged, yes, there are conditions that could cause damage to those areas, so that you experience those type of symptoms. However, with the emergence of mental illness, it's a bit different. So there are theoretically there are theories, like for example, there are theories that those who have a diagnosis of like schizophrenia, they may have too much, dopamine,
Right.
too much dopamine flowing. It might have unlocked something. It's kind of the theory of, how these things emerge. There's a connection where, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are really the only two um, psychiatric disorders or mental health disorders that seem to have some type of biological component, in that if you have a family member who's had schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, there is a higher likelihood that you could be diagnosed later down the line. Um, there are individuals who, may use marijuana or other type of drugs that could kind of awake or bring about their first psychotic, break or psychotic symptoms, and then next thing you know, they have the diagnosis and it doesn't go away. But in terms of kind of identifying areas of damage in the brain, that's not necessarily my wheelhouse. But what I do know is that when it comes to the emergence of mental disorders, it's not quite the same as you would see the kind of like a biological pathology, in that,
Hmm.
conditions like maybe dementia or conditions like a traumatic brain injury or something like that would actually cause damage to those areas. With mental illness, it's a bit different.
Right. So how does like you mentioned, marijuana could result in a mental health issue? Like clinical presentation of that would be like hallucinations or whatever. Like
Mhm.
how does that happen when we look at a person's social history, like their childhood, their household life? How does like a condition like psychosis emerge?
Okay. So again, there is no kind of set or identifiable, like it's not these are conditions that are not like, diabetes, so to speak.
Yeah.
So diabetes, you can kind of, map how this happened.
Hmm.
Hypertension, same thing. But there are kind of social variables that seem to be a theme. So you could argue that, high stress environments, uh, childhood maltreatment, um, those are, trauma, abuse. Those things could be arguably variables that bring about these type of conditions, particularly high stress and unmanaged stress. However, again, there is no kind of set in stone way that these types of things emerge. Again, with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, if you have, grandma or mom had it, and you're faced with high stress environment, and you're experimenting with different types of drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And then one would argue or develop into this person who's experimenting with these type of hard drugs, so to speak. There are social implications there as well. So that and such as the ones I already mentioned. And so those things kind of can create different types of, or bring about, let me say it that way, different types of disorders. There's actually a high, there's a high correlation between individuals who are in foster care eventually being diagnosed with a mental illness. And arguably, it has a lot to do with how foster care is designed and how it is maintained within our society. There is and it becomes a high likelihood that individuals will have either a mental illness and or actually have a stint in jail, as an incarcerated individual. So, there are systemic or social experiences or situations where there is a higher correlation of those individuals who are diagnosed with a mental illness.
So going back to the jail-based competency and restoration service you were
Mm-hmm.
mentioning earlier, and why is this a big issue? I just want to understand this really correctly. So when a person has a mental issue,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't really, like, it's not really predictive of someone commit a crime, but they could, I don't know how to word this, but it creates a they they're more kind of a victim in terms of breaking the law.
I don't know if I would term it as they're a victim of breaking the law,
Mm-hmm.
as more that there is a higher probability
Higher
that
probability.
if you have a mental illness that is severe and persistent, that
Mm-hmm.
because of the limited resources in the community, that you may end up in jail or in prison. Because
Okay.
if you have housing instability, that means that you're living on the streets, either in a tent or you're sleeping on the bench. Either way,
Mm-hmm.
you're nomadic in some way or transient. If you have housing instability, that means that you could also have food insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that you could be rummaging
Right.
through the trash and eating. And if you're rummaging through the trash, let's say there's a restaurant, nice restaurant that's maybe a block away from where you usually live on the bench or under the bridge, and there's going to be food there, and you got to eat. You're hungry, you feel it. It's instinctual, it's biological that you need to eat, and where it is. It's just one block away, and you're going in their dumpster. Well, the restaurant says, "Don't ever come back here. You're trespassing. Don't come back here." And they call the police, and the police say, "You can't come back here. You better not ever come back here." Well, if they know that's where the food is, they know the good stuff is there in that dumpster, then even though you told them not to come back there, they're going to come back. And then the
Mm-hmm.
next time they come back, that's criminal trespass. But then let's say that they come back and and one of the workers is like, "Get out of here, get away from here." And next thing you know, they're arguing back and forth with the worker. Their severe persistent mental illness, all they're doing is thinking about eating, getting their food, and the worker is trying to impede them from eating, and then they punch the worker. So then that's another charge. So what I'm saying is that they're not necessarily victims of such crimes, because unfortunately a lot of times these are crimes that identifiably they likely did commit. However, they're in a social situation where there's no social nets and there's no social supports. I mean, I cannot tell you how many individuals actually, even when they come to be restored, and they are getting a little bit better, we still can't even identify family members for them. So what does that do? When you are someone who is chronically and severely mentally ill, and you don't have any family that is trying to find you or see about you, unfortunately, you end up in jail. If there's not people like me who are trained and who understand how these systems work, in addition to how to provide the treatment and make determinations, then these people a lot of times can get lost in the system and be in jails for years for low level offenses. Now, in those cases, I think that they would be victims of the criminal justice system because they end up in a system for years with no movement in their case and honestly forgotten when there's nobody there to advocate for them and to make sure that they're getting the treatment that they need.
Well, first of all, the work you do is just so wonderful, and I I cannot even imagine how many people are basically stuck, and they have nowhere to get, like they have no outlet or no path to get out and function in the real world. So
Absolutely.
thank you for that. How does a process looks like? How does it look like for a person who is kind of, let's say, is charged with something, and it's a low level charge, and they're like, let's say, stuck for 2 years in the jail? So how does the process look like, and how would you help them along with other clinicians to, like, what does basically the whole process A to Z look like? And so what's the end goal for that person? Obviously the end goal, I can like kind of assume that end goal would be to just get them out of jail and get them proper mental health service.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that look like?
Okay, so that can look a number of different ways.
Okay.
So let's say that I've talked about some of the social situations that may cause them to be involved criminally or involved in the judicial system. And
Mhm.
so let's say they get arrested. Okay, so they're arrested, they're booked, they go to the jail. Okay, someone involved in the courts, whether that be their own attorney or the prosecuting attorney or the judge, raises concerns about their competency to stand trial. Once the concern about their competency to stand trial is raised through a motion, then the judge typically grants the motion. And so then they are ordered to undergo an evaluation of their competency to stand trial. Now, again, there's a lag. There tends to be a lag there. But once they are evaluated, and let's say they are opined incompetent, then the report will go back to the court. The judge will make a determination, usually the same as the evaluator, that they're incompetent, and then they will be ordered to undergo competency restoration services. Again, there could be a significant lag between the time they're ordered for competency restoration services and the time that they actually begin participating in treatment. Once they begin participating in treatment, then they have 3-month periods of trying to become restored. Let's say on average, 3 to 6 months is the time that it'll take for most people to be restored if they're actively participating in treatment and their symptoms are active psychotic symptoms that can be treated well through antipsychotic medication. Once they complete treatment, hopefully they will have a court date soon thereafter. However, there are times when they don't. And so either they are held at the hospital or at the jail-based competency restoration program, ideally so that we can maintain their competency status, or unfortunately they're taken back to wherever they came from in their home jail. And unfortunately, if individuals are not really staying on top of it at the home jail, they could decompensate. And if they decompensate, then they may be ordered to participate in competency restoration services again before they even go. So that's another 3 to 6 months at least, okay, if they decompensate. Now, let's say the person doesn't decompensate and they get a court date. Then they're able to move forward through the process and hopefully get a disposition. However, time becomes a major factor here. Because let's say that this person only has a charge of criminal trespass, which means that it's a misdemeanor and they can only get up to a year in jail. A lot of times, by the time they get through competency restoration services, they've already been in jail for a year, or they've been under judicial supervision and monitoring, or they've been captive for a year in terms of the loss of their freedom. So what do we do then? So sometimes we can work with the courts and they can do what is called quash, or kind of throw out the charge, because essentially they've done the punishment, and then they can be released, hopefully with some resources that are adequate and that will keep them from recidivism or coming back to jail. Unfortunately, even in those times, sometimes we just discharge them to the street because there's nowhere to go, there's no family. And unfortunately, there are times where people have literally been discharged or released to the street, and within hours are in jail again, which I think is a huge disservice. However, when we don't have enough resources in the community, and we don't have leaders who are as dedicated and as keenly aware in how these things need to be addressed, then the resources just won't be there, and it's legitimately nothing we can do. Another challenge is that, now we were talking about low-level offenses, but let's say that they did have a charge that was pretty serious, like a sex offense, or a serious aggravated assault charge, or something of that nature. Then the resources sometimes are even more limited, because shelters a lot of times have certain stipulations. And when you are a felon, or you're a convicted individual, particularly a man of a violent crime, that knocks you out of a lot of different resources, even group homes when you need them. I've also worked as a correctional psychologist in the prison system here in Georgia. And when we have what is called returning citizens, our returning citizens, a lot of times, reentry services, they're trying their best, because it's called reentry, because you're reintegrating into society as a returning citizen. However, there are certain counties that we can't, because of their involvement and because of them being in prison, the county won't take them back. So we have to put them somewhere else to figure out where they go. Sometimes they have to be bought a bus ticket. Sometimes people don't even have the resources to know how to load the small amount of money they get when they are released onto the debit card. They don't even know how to activate it sometimes. So there's a lot of issues around how we treat the incarcerated. And the punishment is much greater than being deprived of your freedom. Because I won't even, I don't want to get too far off the beaten track, but even within the jail and prison systems, their experience in there with the type of health care they receive, the type of food they're given, the level of violence that they are subjected to, potentially, those only serve, as you kind of alluded to exacerbate their mental health symptoms. It only serves to exacerbate them. And so, to your point earlier, those who are on the front end when it comes to jail-based competency restoration services, they haven't been convicted of anything yet. So they're just in the jail system, and they may not feel the burden or the heaviness of the potential consequences of their charges, but they do feel the stress of the environment. And that is for sure. and the environments can be extremely stressful. There's a whole nother culture that we could talk about that occurs when you're in the prison in particular. It's its own microcosm of society and the world, and they have their own code within the actual institutional policies and procedures that one must be aware of in order to, one, maintain safety, but also to be able to treat people effectively.
That sounds like such a complex thing to like piece out. What is the jail culture really like then?
Well, so I'll talk about jails and prisons. So jails
Okay.
are a bit more dynamic. What I mean by dynamic is that they're more transient. So you have people coming in, coming out. So you can kind of get used to the environment a bit, but as soon as you think you get used to one of your roommates or your cellmates, they're gone. And you get a new roommate, you get a new cellmate. And so that environment being so transient and dynamic, you're always kind of on edge, or you have a potential of being on edge because you don't know who's coming in, who's coming out, what they know, what they don't know, what they've been exposed to, or versus what you've been exposed to, how dangerous or violent they are. They may be the type of individuals that create shanks and will shank you or try to sexually assault you. You don't know because it's so dynamic. So there isn't, or so transient within the jail setting. That is kind of always having your ears, eyes open, ready for anything, not really sure what might happen. That's the jail culture. Okay. Now the prison culture is much more settled because oftentimes you have people who've been there 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So now you have your own little city. So like, let's say that they, individuals in terms of the religious, let's talk about the religious nature. So I've worked in prisons where they have imams, those who practice Islam within prison. They have imams within the prison setting that they designate an individual to be that person for them. Um, and that's its own little connection, or I hate to call it a faction. That's kind of, that has a negative connotation at times, but they have their own little set of individuals, and each group, there's a group that's been kind of forged out, sometimes for protection, sometimes for a sense of community. And prisons have their own code, their own expectations, who kind of calls the shots, who's the leaders, and you have to basically, if you're someone coming into a prison, you have to acculturate, which sounds odd when you say come into a prison, but different camps have different types of cultures and expectations. You know who the person is to go to when you need XYZ and done. You kind of know, they know the staff well enough that they know how this thing works, how that things work. And it's almost down to a science in terms of being predictable, in terms of knowing exactly how things run. And they will actually become upset if you don't know how things are run or how it works. So, it's like, wait a minute now, we're supposed to do this at this time. This isn't supposed to happen at this time. We've been doing this for years, just like this. So the prison is very much more settled. Now, violence still occurs. But again, there's a little bit more predictability because you know the players. Often you've been in prison with, these people have been in prison with each other for 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way 20, 25 years. So you know everyone, you know them well. You might know their intimate details of their life. You might know about their families. You might know about their personal struggles. So it's a greater level of community within prison, for better or for worse. And the reason why I say for better or for worse is because sometimes when there is that greater level of community, then violence can ensue or violence can happen because someone violates, in their perspective, what that bond or sense of community is.
Awesome. I did not know that. Like difference in cultures and just how your service kind of is is different between these two cultures. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Um, Going back to the resources. I know you said there's like the like there's lack of resources in terms of mental health delivery.
Mhm.
How can we what are your theories about how can we improve those resources for these people who are in trial? And honestly, this could just be reflective of like the general population as well when we talk about the people who are in trial.
Unfortunately, just like most situations, all this boils down to the money and how
Okay.
things are budgeted. We have to prioritize in our leaders individuals who are willing to listen and to hear the issues or the concerns that the community or the society has pertaining to mental health. There has to be a greater level of allocation of funding, resources, and that's not to say that that's not happening slowly. So slowly, there are different things being passed. I think even recently, here in this state, there were a few measures being passed to try to help in that regard. However, it's still vastly insufficient. Because not only do we need more funding to create this type of programming, we need more funding in order to recruit and retain highly trained individuals who know how to provide treatment and evaluations. Because unfortunately, even if you have the programming there, but you don't have the people who have that level of training or skill set, then you're going to create further delays because when individuals who are carrying out these tasks don't know or are not equipped to work in these type of positions, then you get further delays as a result of their ignorance or under informed how things work. And so I can't say enough is that we have to be very proactive with, educating our leaders and or other decision makers in the community about the need for funding and greater resources.
I understand there is a need for money to deliver mental health resources.
Mhm.
What do you recommend for clinicians, current clinicians, future clinicians, students, psychiatry or medical students, PA students, um, clinical psychology students? What are we supposed to do if money is limited? What kind of education we are supposed to provide when we are eventually dealing with these types of people in real world? What are some of the like what's your advice on, let's say, behavioral things that people could do, people who are in trial or people who are like just general public, like
Mhm.
things that we need to do in order to, let's say we have a mental health condition that is regardless of funding and money and mental health service, because a lot of students or a lot of people in the world, right, so they have mental health illnesses, they fail to get help
Mhm.
because there's lack of resources, there's stigma around it. But some of them also want to do it by themselves. I know that's not the most ideal thing, to take control of your mental health, like sit in a room and just maybe journal or something.
Mhm.
But like what are do you do you kind of what kind of education you provide to these people in jail in terms of managing their mental health? I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. So I heard a couple things in there, but I'll address what you just said now
Hmm.
first. So what I do is I definitely educate them about the benefits and the drawbacks of attempting of what you just said as kind of taking your own mental health by the reins. Now, you can do so by seeking services. But by you trying to manage this, such and such, and I relate those drawbacks to real world experiences. So it's an easy thing to do. Not well, easy might be a little bit uh, not quite the right descriptor, but I think it's easier in that when someone's in jail or in prison, I can definitely relate real world experiences or real world problems that have come from them trying to quote unquote control their own, mental health or take control of their own condition. Most of the time, those who have serious and persistent mental illness experiment with recreational drugs as a means to address their mental illness. And because of such, a lot of times you can directly relate their criminal or legal involvement to their use of recreational drugs.
Right.
And so that's what makes it a bit easier. Now, those who are on the kind of functioning every day in society who have never been legally involved or criminally involved. They're going to work every day. They're able to go to work every day for the most part. They're taking care of their children, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times I educate them about the emotional burden or baggage that we carry when we are trying to manage our mental health or our mental health condition on our own, and how sometimes we don't show up for our children the way that we could if we actually had some assistance of someone to lessen the load or carry some of that baggage for us, or do some of the heavy lifting. How we don't show up for our partners the way that we could. How our mental health conditions being inadequately managed or can actually cause us health conditions, health problems like hypertension or poor sleep, or anxiety actually, being very much connected to when, people who have shingles, who get shingles sometimes is related, it's anxiety or stress induced, overindulgence in alcohol and what that does to us. So I try again to relate that to real world problems. Now, you had also kind of in the beginning asked questions about, as in terms of these lack of resources, what can students do? Students who are studying and training now, who eventually are coming into the healthcare in industry or healthcare area. Generally speaking, those who I meet who are coming into healthcare, whether that's mental health or that is actual, physical health or medically related, they're coming in there for a reason. A lot of them are academically excited about the information that they're learning, but they also have this goal of wanting to help others. And so a lot of times, because of the way our instruction is given or the way the pedagogy is related to the different disciplines within healthcare, we focus so much on providing direct care services, and we focus so much on, maybe the administrative aspect of providing direct care services or learning different procedures or techniques, etc. So huge focus on those things. And those things are very important. Nonetheless, in my purview, it is equally important that as we choose our leaders, because we're all members of the same society, and as we choose our leaders, instead of having our head buried and kind of only kind of hyper focus in on what we've learned in school and making and doing that in the real world, we have to also be just as interested in educating our leaders about what it is that we need and how it is that what we do, how valuable it is, and how, in particular for mental health, if we look at the salaries of mental health professionals, those who have, often they have at least one advanced degree, sometimes two or three advanced degrees, to begin someone with that level of education and training with less than six figures, you're only making $75,000 or $80,000. Sometimes if you have a master's level degree, I'll take it to myself, because all these words and everything that I'm sharing are my own thoughts and not those of any institution that I'm affiliated with. I'll take it to myself. After having a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Virginia, and then a terminal master's degree in counseling from what is now referred to as the University of Lynchburg, and 1,000 hours of free supervised clinical hours doing the work. After all of that, my starting salary at my first job was only $34,000. I
That
was
is
in more
unfair.
debt I was in much more debt than my yearly salary was. And I attempted to negotiate and could not. It was either take it or leave it. And the thing is about business, which is what we need to learn as healthcare professionals, we need to learn about business. The thing is about business is that if you can't get, if I'm offering you something that is comparable to what you would get other places, then there's no reason for me to pay you what you're worth. And so, in that vein, when you come out of school, you need to be keenly aware of your opportunities for salary. Because is it all about salary? No. But there are times in my training where I was working with people who I was in a worse financial state than they were. Now, in terms of mental health, that was useful because I said, and they make us, a lot of times, especially working with youth, sometimes they'll draw assumptions. They'll say, well, you're only here for the money, something of that nature. When you know personally that what you're making, and in comparison to the years of training, the free hours that you got, the hours of supervision, et cetera, you know that it's grossly inadequate. But you can't really share that necessarily.
Yeah.
But I say all that to say is that students must, as they enter to the workforce, must be aware of your value and what your bottom line is. And often we're just so excited about doing the work because this is what excites us. But we also have to be understanding about our value, because I'll never forget that $34,000, and I was $100,000.
That's
So
just unfair.
those are things that we have to really think about. And a lot of people argue, well, look for scholarships. Don't go to any school, or don't pursue any type of education unless you can get it paid for. That's a
Easier
fair
said than done.
that's a fair argument, but at the same time, how realistic that is
Hmm.
quite shaky.
Yeah,
Because then we have people who are only going into fields that they know that they can get paid for, or that they can have funded in some way, and then there's a shortage over in these other areas. It's just it's kind of in my opinion, it's a disingenuous. It's fair in some ways, but it's a bit disingenuous to suggest that every single person can, find funding to go to school, you know, as if that's an easy task, or that's a task that can be easily done. And so what is it that you do? If you're a capable person, and this is your field, this is what you love doing, and this is what you feel like your purpose in life is, you're supposed to just wait until you figure it out, and then you discover that it still won't ever be totally paid for. So anyway, I say all that to say that students must be to have a two-pronged focus. What is the business side of what it is that you do? And then what is the direct care services and what your passion, what your love is? And if we come in two-pronged, and we challenge our leaders to make a greater investment in these sort resources, and hinge it upon whether or not they're reelected or not, I think that those are the type of things that will serve us well moving forward.
that was a solid advice, Dr. Lewis. Solid advice for not only people who are going into the field right now, but also who are in the field. So thank you so much for your message. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about before we end our conversation?
No, I mean, I could talk about this subject forever.
Yeah.
I hope that my passion kind of was able to be seen through our discussion that we had already. But I don't want to further belabor or extend our talk. But if there's ever a time where you have any follow-up questions, or want to learn more about how mental health looks in the corrections environment, then I'm more than welcome to come back and talk. We also didn't really get a lot into the other types of evaluations that forensic psychologists perform, like, dangerousness, violence risk assessments, psychosexual evaluations, even all the way to the civil area where workers' compensation, personal injury. There's so many different areas that we work through in terms of helping decision makers. And perhaps at another time, we can kind of get into those areas as well.
That would be absolutely wonderful for not only me, because I love learning about psychological assessments and related subjects like that you just mentioned. And so I'll definitely have you back again soon. We'll chat up a time and something will work out next time, definitely.
Indeed. Sounds good. I enjoy talking about it, and this is something that I'm quite passionate about. So anytime that we can come together, me and maybe you and others as well, I'm always open.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Lewis, thank you for coming on to the show and for doing your part in psychology and in just educating the general public of what goes on in your field, because I think everyone should know about all this. Lack of resources we face, whether people who are in trial and elsewhere. And so thank you so much, Dr. Lewis.
Indeed.
I will definitely keep in touch and we'll have a part 2.
No problem. Take care. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.